Welcome back to Gaming with Spoons. This is my official review of Spider-Man on the PlayStation 4. Spider-Man has been one of the games that I have most been looking forward to. Ever since I heard that Insomniac Games was going to be getting their hands on the Spider-Man franchise, I was absolutely excited to see what this game was going to offer. And let me tell you, it definitely does live up to the hype. It has its problems, it has things that the sequel can very much potentially work on, and overall though, I feel like it's a very solid game and a great start to what can become one of Sony's most staple series. So with that out of the way, that being said, let's go ahead and hop into our review. Now, for the sake of this review, there is going to be no spoilers whatsoever, but I do want to talk about one of the big negatives that I feel that the game definitely has to offer, and that was, in a sense, its story. Its story is good. Its story definitely sets up its own universe, takes a lot of inspiration from the comics, some of the characters, and incorporates them in there very well. There's definitely certain elements of the story that I like, but I didn't like the overall direction that they took the last half of the game. It definitely hit an emotional impact, which is what they were going for, but just overall I felt that they could have taken it into a very different situation than what they did. Still though, the ending was very satisfying. I did enjoy it quite a bit, and it definitely did leave it open for a potential sequel. So very curious to see where they are going to take this story and expand this universe. There is rumor floating around that they are potentially thinking about maybe bringing in Daredevil and some other characters into this universe as well. So maybe we'll end up getting a Daredevil game. It's hard to say, but it's something that something that's definitely potential later on down the road. Now, something I do want to talk about next is its combat, because its combat, it has some really great moments to it. There are a couple of annoyances, which we're really going to get into here in a little bit, but let's focus on the positives. If you've played the Batman Arkham games or Shadow of War, or even Assassin's Creed, you're going to be very familiar with its combat and its stealth mechanics, as it borrows heavily from those games. Now, my philosophy is if it's not broken, don't fix it. At this point, the Batman game has pretty much refined combat that flows very smoothly. We've seen Shadow of War use it, we've seen other games such as Mad Max kind of use that same type of combat. Spider-Man is kind of no different. It has that simple button press where you can build up combos, you can use dodge, you can use but this time it's Spidey sense, so you actually see, like, when a laser is on Spider-Man, you can dodge, and it will kind of show the dodge maneuver as you fight through combat. It looks really smooth, plays really smooth, but it also makes it feel very unique to Spider-Man's character, and that's something that I did enjoy. Another aspect that I really enjoyed was the stealth mechanics in the game. There's a lot of areas where you'll be going through doing stealth mechanics, playing through stealth missions, having to take down enemies. This is always where I get the most enjoyment out of these games. The Batman games, I absolutely loved doing this as well. Being able to sneak around and pick enemies off one by one is how I like to play these games. So the stealth missions were always very, very enjoyable. Now, again, like I said, it borrows very heavily from the Batman Arkham series. You have little perks that you can stand on, little takedowns that you can do, but it does make it its own as it uses Spider-Man's abilities. So being able to do a perch takedown, kind of put them up on the wall, doing a web strike where you sling onto the enemy, then go and punch them down to the ground, knocking them out. There's also mechanics where you're able to go in and actually set up a trip mine, so you can use that to essentially have a web come and grab the enemy and pin them on the wall. You can use bombs, you can use impact webs, which shoves the enemy pretty much on top of the wall if aimed correctly at the right time. You have web bombs, which can hold enemies down, and you also just have the ability to be able to shoot an enemy and hold them up or have it tangle them so you're able to take them down much easier. Now, you also do unlock other abilities as time goes on, so the combat in a sense does get easier to an extent. So like one ability that I found extremely useful when I was able to unlock it was the ability to steal enemies' guns from them using the webs. And then you were able to go in and kind of attack them. That eliminated the potential of being shot, so you only had to worry about soldiers that were punching you. Now, one thing the game does offer and do kind of differently in its combat is the fact that the characters have, the enemies kind of all have different types of setups. You have your enemies who have melee weapons, which can use them to kind of block. You have your people who run around with riot shields. You have Mr. Negative's enemies who use swords that are super irritating sometimes. You basically have to wait for a vulnerable moment in order to use them. You of course have the brutes, which you pretty much can't beat head on. You either have to spit your webs at them, tangle them up that way. You can stealth take them down. If you're lucky enough, you might be able to make them hit that trip mine to pin them on the wall. You might be able to use an impact and put them on the wall, but it's all very timed very differently. And there's going to be kind of a different playstyle. How you use these tools kind of all just depends on you and how you want to go about playing this game. Now, as I said with the stealth mechanics, again, it's pretty simplistic, pretty easy to go about doing what you're going to do, and picking enemies off one by one is sometimes going to be useful. Now, the main problem that I did have with the combat, again, it wasn't really a huge issue. It never really took away, it just made some fights very frustrating at times. For whatever reason, the aiming system in this game has a little bit of difficulty. I found times that sometimes I'd want to throw an item at a certain enemy and it would go to a completely different, unexpected enemy as he walked right into the middle of the fight, taking down the enemy that I didn't want to take down. There were also times that I would try to take a gun away from an enemy and again would hit a different enemy and completely not be able to hit the enemy that I intended it to. There were times where I'd use the web shots to try and make an enemy immobilized for a little bit, but it would hit an enemy that I didn't want to. This just made some battles much more frustrating than they needed to be. There's one particular late game boss fight where you fight two enemies at once that this definitely did become a problem. Again, it wasn't a huge deal breaker, it just made that fight much more difficult than it needed to be. And frustratingly enough, I would sometimes just fire at him and they would not hit. They'd go to a different enemy. And it was absolutely frustrating. It's something that I feel needs to be worked upon in the game a little bit better. Even having something where you can kind of maybe just even use the D-pad to kind of help select the enemies that you want to hit and fire would be a nice way to go in and patch this up and make it run a lot smoother. The other part of the gameplay that I really didn't enjoy, it was almost more immersion breaking than anything, taking the control out of Spider-Man's hands and putting it in the hands of Miles Morales and Mary Jane. Now, these segments, I get why they did that. They kind of played into the story a little bit, but as I said, they kind of just took away. Most of the missions where you were just sneaking around trying not to be seen by the enemies, pretty much because these characters were vulnerable and you couldn't really attack enemies with them. I get why they were there. As I said, they were crucial to the story, but I feel that these could have just been reduced to cinematics at this point and it really would have had no big difference on the game. They were segments every time they popped up, I'd just roll my eyes because they weren't exactly enjoyable. And though I can see kind of why Mary Jane's was in there, I don't really understand the emphasis of why they had to put such a huge emphasis on Miles Morales as a playable character. Whereas I kind of feel like Miles could have just had cinematics, played a key role in the story, and kind of gone from there. But other than that, the gameplay was really solid and it was something that I thoroughly enjoyed. Another thing I really have to compliment this game for is its boss fights. Most games that in this modern day and age have their boss fights reduced to action sequences or quick time events. Though Spider-Man does have these every once in a while where you have to kind of press square to do it, they are very few and in between. The boss fights also really pay homage to the different abilities that these villains actually have. As you go through and fight these different villains, each of the boss fights kind of play to their strengths, and you'll have to figure out what web-based attacks work best on these enemies, making the boss fights a lot more engaging than, say, what the Arkham games have ever really been able to achieve. But this game was able to pull it off really, really well. There's also a lot of tension building in the boss fights as well, something that I really actually enjoyed. Now, that being said, one last negative note that I want to go on and talk about was the side missions end up getting very, very repetitive. Once you kind of do a few, you kind of get a solid basis of the way they're going to go, and that's just kind of the way that it is. It very much takes that open world aspect and just kind of puts filler content in there. Not really rewarding to the story, not really pertaining to the story. It's just kind of there to offer additional hours of content to continue to get you to play. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I do tend to like it when the side quests feel rewarding, like they're there for more world building. I mean, you can only go through and save so many citizens from getting beat up by thugs before it becomes a tedious task. Other than that, the Spider-Man game was absolutely good. I really did enjoy it. I thought its story, for the most part, held up pretty well. I found its characters very interesting. The writers over at Insomniac really paid attention to the detail in the characters. There were a few key things with some of the villains that I feel like that they kind of missed the point on, but again, I realized that they tried to make it their own. Spider-Man is definitely a game that if you own a PlayStation 4, you should pick up. This is going to be a game that I feel a lot of people are going to enjoy. It is a game that I feel, as the sequel comes on, like Arkham City did before, it's going to build on what this game originally did, and the sequel is going to be much, much better. I'm very curious to see where Insomniac and Sony are going to take this franchise next. With that being said, I think it's time we go in and put a number on this. I am giving Spider-Man on the PlayStation 4 an 8 out of 10. Despite some of the small annoyances that I had, namely the immersion breaking of running around as the other characters, and some of those annoyances that came with combat, and the slight little disappointment there towards the end of the game's story, this is still a really great game. The combat is solid, it really goes in and focuses on Spider-Man's abilities and what makes a great Spider-Man game, and it is definitely worthy of being a game in your game collection. If you are looking to pick up this game or have been curious about it, you've been waiting for reviews to come through, and you're kind of sitting on the fence, I definitely recommend it. Chances are a lot of these issues with the story that I had, you may not end up having there towards the end, and it's very enjoyable. But you guys have been watching Gaming with Spoons. Be sure to hit subscribe there for me to keep up to date with all of my content. You can follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Links are going to be down below in that description box. You guys have been watching Gaming with Spoons, and most importantly, stay happy, be happy, game happy. Spoons is checking out.